Warning, this podcast contains heavy spoilers for not just one movie, but entire franchises. We highly recommend going and watching these movies before listening to us as a companion piece that stitches all the timelines into one creepy, crime-ridden story. There will be no more spoiler warnings. We do not break character. After this, there is no turning back. You've been warned. Hit the music.
You are talking about the nonsensical ravings of a lunatic mind.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
It's alive! It's alive!
I just realised I haven't done a joke in a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But, no, to be fair, the last week or so has been because I couldn't find any good zombie jokes. And I still can't find any good zombie jokes. So here are some dad zombie jokes.
Oh, class.
No, they're not great. They're okay. To start with, we will start off easy. What do you do if you see a zombie roll their eyes?
Hand them back to them?
Roll them back.
Oh, roll them back.
What did the zombie bank robber say to the cops? You'll never take me alive! Where do zombies eat dinner?
I don't know.
The living room.
Ah.
What do zombie college students eat?
What do they eat?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
Ramen.
I knew it was got to do about noodles. Oh, yeah, I get that.
I'm nearly there. Why don't any zombies eat popcorn with their fingers?
I don't know.
Because they like to eat their fingers separately. And last one, the lamest of them all. Mm-hmm. What do dyslexic zombies eat?
Brines.
Hello and welcome to It's Alive podcast. This is a true crime, paranormal, interstellar podcast covering unbelievable stories that sound like they were ripped straight from the pages of a Hollywood script. I'm your host, the man of many names, the outlaw Harley Ray, the bruiser Bronson, Dr. H.R. Smokenstein, THC, or you can call me Josh for short. And with me as always is my very own scream queen, the perfect combination of beauty and brains, the bride of Smokenstein, the India horror, the expert, the guts and gore, the gorgeous, the sexy Aimee Rose.
Hi.
So how are you this week after all the knowledge I dropped on you last week?
I'm a little scared.
Yeah, learning the truth about the living dead can do that to you.
Well, but no, I'm a little scared that I never knew you believed all of this stuff. I mean, we have kids together. Does that mean they're half conspiracists now?
Very funny. But come on, you can't say I didn't make some sense. I mean, I went scientific with this shit.
No, to be fair, there was a little logic in there, and I can see how some people can get confused. I mean, if I saw sick people roaming around attacking people and the news reports you played for us last week, I'd believe it too. I'm just saying there's two sides to every story, and while you claim zombie, the US government claims otherwise. I mean, why would they admit to something as serious as biological weapons leak if they were going to lie about what happened? Would it not have fit their agenda better to blame the Russians? Like it happened during the Cold War, so they seem like the natural patsy in this situation.
Yeah, but do you know what's better than making them believe the Russians did it? Letting the Russians see the level of your weaponry without stepping over the line and heating up the Cold War. Plus, if your people believe it's a Russian weapon, then you risk demoralising your army and your average citizen, panic riots and defeat soon follow. Some even believe that the events we spoke of last week could have been a US government false flag operation for the very reason I just outlined.
What's a false flag operation?
That's a complicated question with a complicated answer, so I went to Wikipedia for a simple explanation. According to Wiki, a false flag operation is an act committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on another party. The term false flag originated in the 16th century as an expression meaning an intentional misrepresentation of someone's allegiance. The term was famously used to describe a ruse in naval warfare whereby a vessel flew the flag of a neutral or enemy country in order to hide its true identity.
Like pirates. Like this tactic was originally used by pirates to deceive other ships into allowing them to move closer before attacking them. It was later deemed an acceptable practice during naval warfare according to international maritime laws, providing the attacking vessel displayed its true flag once an attack had begun.
So they have to wait until once the fight starts, they officially have to have their own thing. Okay.
Exactly.
The term today extends to include countries that organise attacks on themselves and make the attacks appear to be by enemy nations or terrorists, thus giving the nation that was supposedly attacked a pretext for domestic repression or foreign military aggression.
So the belief is America zombified Pennsylvania to scare Russia into submission.
Yep. It's the same belief held by 9/11 conspiracy theorists. They believe the Bush administration planned the 9/11 attacks, blaming hardcore Muslim terrorist groups so as to give themselves an excuse to go to war in the Middle East, in turn gaining control of some of the most lucrative oil pipelines in the world.
Let's not go there.
That's good, because I don't have the time for that can of worms right now, and it feels like more of a Real Monsters case anyway. That's Real Monsters, available on Patreon with new episodes dropping weekly.
Nice plug.
Thank you. So what do I have to do to convince you that this is possible?
I don't know. Like last week, you said you get into the history of the creation of trioxin and its reagent. Something to do about a Dr. West?
Herbert West, yes. Now, I will say that if you're on the fence with the zombie conspiracy, then this story might tip you over the line one way or the other. If you're 100% my made up, this didn't happen, then this evidence, and I use that term loosely, will not sway you one little bit.
Why not?
Because technically, the man named Herbert West never really existed. Not on paper, anyway. The tales of the exploits and experiments of Herbert West don't come with a lot of verified or legally binding sources. Today, we have to do things a little differently. Instead of me just throwing fact after fact at you, we have to rely on the man's ability to tell a story. While I did allude to West's name being mentioned in the 1971 document leaks, all that really confirmed was that a scientist using the alias Herbert West worked in a secret government facility. It doesn't clearly state what he worked on or when his research ended. For that information, we have to go to West's former proteges. West's background and eventual demise comes to us from his later assistant, Dr. Howard Phillips. We'll kick off with his description of West's early life before we tell the story of West's pre-government research and work as told by his original assistant, Dr. Daniel Kane. So as I said, this first part comes to us from Dr. Howard Phillips, who claims to have worked with West for 10 years in a secret government facility based in the Everglades in Pennsylvania.
If it's so secret, then why is this guy able to talk about it?
After the events of 1969, Dr. Phillips became a whistleblower, going to the media with wild claims of corpse reanimation. He claimed that himself and West's work was funded by the government in a bid to find a toxin that would revive the dead, originally to use on downed soldiers, making them impervious to death. But when it became clear that the perfect restoration of the mind was near impossible, the government changed tactics, deciding that if they couldn't restore their own troops to full working order, then they could do the next best thing and revive the feral wild corpses of their enemy, forcing them to deal with the ensuing zombie attack while leaving themselves open for US troops to attack from another angle.
That's some big claims. Like, why haven't I ever heard of him? It feels like right or wrong is something that would be recorded somewhere, like newspaper, radio reports.
It was never taken seriously, and the media was suppressed. An injunction was filed by the US government, and Phillips' claims were stricken from the record. After that, things didn't get much better for old Howie, but we'll get into that later. So I'll go back to the start. Phillips was born in 1920 in Arkham, Massachusetts. By his own admission, his childhood was a normal one. Well, as normal as a childhood could be in Arkham. According to Phillips, Arkham is the hometown of Dr. Herbert West and his assistant, Dr. Daniel Kane. Throughout his childhood, he said he remembers hearing stories of the mad scientist that dug up the dead to experiment on the bodies. It was kind of like a local urban legend. By the time Howard would have been a teen, West and Kane had graduated from the Miskatonic University and had started their own practice in the small New England town of Bolton. According to Phillips, West was born and raised in Arkham, growing up in a strict Christian household. West was a genius from birth. Think Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory, or young Sheldon, I suppose, for this period of his life. Actually, exactly like that. His family were hardcore religious, but West always leaned towards logic and science over faith. So think Sheldon and his mom.
Yeah.
This lean towards logic became solidified by a tragic event that happened in West's life around his early teens. The story goes that on the way to church one Sunday morning, West's mother and sister were run over by a bus. I don't know if you've seen a bus from 1913, but it looks like it would do some serious damage. I didn't even think they existed at that stage, to be honest with you.
They had them.
It's said that a heartbroken West prayed over his family's mangled corpse, begging and pleading with God to bring back his devout Christian mother and young innocent sister. His logic being God should spare them, as they only lost their lives because they had to go to church to praise him. And this was evident as they were struck down only feet from the church, and surely a just God would reward his followers, especially ones as devout to him as Mother West.
I'm guessing the prayers didn't work.
Well, he forgot to add the thoughts beforehand. If you don't pair thoughts with prayers, they don't work. I learned that from the Karens on Facebook.
No.
It was this incident that acted as the motivation for West's life work, to spit in God's face and cure death permanently. See, West didn't believe in a soul and didn't believe that death was inevitable, instead viewing it as a disease, something he could treat, something he could cure. Beginning with animals, West started his research and studies, working every waking minute in the pursuit of immortality. Not much more is known about West's early life. For all intents and purposes, West became a recluse, living in his homemade lab, working his way towards his doctorate and the real facilities that he needed to make his work progress.
So until he gets to medical school, he's essentially laying out the groundwork for what he has to do, like researching and doing the math and stuff.
Exactly. So unfortunately, like the Christian god Jesus, West's mortal enemy, Herbert West disappears from history for a number of years throughout his teens, only showing up again in the confession diaries of Dr. Daniel Kane.
Patreon is alive, alive, live, alive, live, alive. Patreon is alive, alive, horror podcast. Patreon is alive, alive, live, alive, live, alive. Patreon is alive, alive, horror podcast.
Hey kids, can't get enough of that blood, guts and gore? Then head on over to our Patreon, where for just $5 a month you'll get exclusive access to our true crime show Real Monsters and horrific history tales from Playing with Bones with Aimee Rose, along with early access to our minisodes and ad-free access to everything else. All this and loads more horror-tastic extras from the Horrorverse. So what are you waiting for? Permission? Go nick your parents' card today and subscribe now at patreon.com/It's Alive Alive Pod. Remember, that's It's Alive Alive Podcast, a really, really fake true crime horror podcast. It's Alive Alive, all the guts and gore with none of the guilt. So this is the point in our story where I'm going to change things up a little. Usually I'd run through the story in a narrator style, telling you the crazy tale beginning, middle, end, but this isn't a normal story. In fact, the only written records of these events are from the confessional diary of Dr. Daniel Kane. The diary was found in a bag of a vagrant man who was found dead on a train travelling across Europe in the late 70s. The elderly man, who was roughly aged in his 70s at the time, was never identified. It's believed that this man was himself Daniel Kane. So instead of narrating the tale as I see it, I'm going to read to you the diary in Kane's own words. Now, I will warn you, some of the language is a bit dated and there is one or two phrases in the text that I might change or just cut out altogether as I go along, out of respect for other people's ethnicities and culture. That being said, sit back, skin up and enjoy story time with the doctor. Alright. So this one is called Part 1 from the Dark.
Hold on, he broke his confession into parts and gave him catchy titles.
Yeah, it appears as if Dr. Kane was a bit of a showman. Oh, what can you do? Actually, we're watching a lot of Frasier at the moment. I nearly picture it being Frasier right now, to be honest. Yeah. I might add it appears.
Crane, yeah.
I might add, it appears that he had this confession written for quite some time before it was discovered, because his dating doesn't make sense if you're going from 1980. Okay. Like almost straight away he says it's begun 17 years before writing the first part. So by that dating, he and West would have still been together when this was written.
Okay.
So anyway, here's Part 1 from the Dark. Ooh. Of Herbert West, who was my friend in college in an afterlife, I can speak only with extreme terror. This terror is not due altogether to the sinister manner in his recent disappearance, but was engendered by the whole nature of his life's work, and first gained its acute form more than 17 years ago when we were in the third year of our course at the Miskatonic University Medical School in Arkham. While he was with me, the wonder and diabolism of his experiments fascinated me utterly, and I was his closest companion. Now that he is gone and the spell is broken, the actual fear is greater. Memories and possibilities are ever more hideous than realities. The first horrible incident of our acquaintance was the greatest shock I ever experienced, and it is only with reluctance that I repeat it. As I have said, it happened when we were in the medical school, where West had already made himself notorious through his wild theories on the nature of death and the possibility of overcoming it artificially. His views, which were widely ridiculed by the faculty and his fellow students, hinged on the essentially mechanistic nature of life, and concerned means for operating the organic machinery of mankind by calculated chemical action after the failure of natural process. In his experiments with various animating solutions, he had killed and treated immense numbers of rabbits, guinea pigs, cats, dogs, and monkeys, till he had become the prime nuisance of the college. Several times he had actually obtained signs of life in the animals supposedly dead, in many cases violent signs. But he soon saw that the perfection of this process, if indeed possible, would necessarily involve a lifetime of research. It likewise became clear that since the same solution never worked alike on different organic species, he would require human subjects for further and more specialized progress. It was here that he first came into conflict with the college authorities and was debarred from future experiments by no less a dignitary than the dean of the medical school himself, the learned and benevolent Dr. Alan Halsey, whose work in behalf of the stricken is recalled by every old resident of Arkham. I had always been exceptionally tolerant of West's pursuits, and we frequently discussed these theories, whose ramifications and corollaries were almost infinite. Holding with Jekyll that all life is a chemical and physical process and that the so-called soul is a myth, my friend believed that artificial reanimation of the dead can depend only on the condition of the tissues, and that unless actual decomposition had set in, a corpse fully equipped with organs may, with suitable measures, be set going again in the peculiar fashion known as life. That the psychic or intellectual life might be impaired by the slight deterioration of sensitive brain cells, which even a short period of death would be apt to cause, West fully realised. It had at first been his hope to find a reagent which would restore vitality before the actual advent of death, and only repeated failures on animals had shown him that the natural and artificial life motions were incompatible. He then sought extreme freshness in his specimens, injecting his solutions into the blood immediately after the extinction of life. It was this circumstance which made the professors so carelessly sceptical, for they felt that true death had not occurred in any case. They did not stop to view the matter closely and reasoningly. It was not long after the faculty had interdicted his work that West confided in me his resolution to get fresh human bodies in some manner, and continue in secret the experiments he could no longer perform openly. To hear him discussing ways and means was rather ghastly, for at the college we had never procured anatomical specimens ourselves. Whenever the morgue proved inadequate, 2 local lads attended to this matter, and they were seldom questioned. West was then a small, slender, spectacled youth with delicate features, yellow hair, pale blue eyes, and a soft voice, and it was uncanny to hear him dwelling on the relative merits of Christchurch Cemetery and the Potter's Field. We finally decided on the Potter's Field because practically everybody in Christchurch was embalmed, a thing of course ruinous to West's research. I was by this time his active and enthralled assistant, and helped him make all his decisions, not only concerning the source of bodies, but concerning a suitable place for our loathsome work. It was I who thought of the deserted Chapman farmhouse beyond Meadow Hill, where we fitted up on the ground floor an operating room and a laboratory, each with dark curtains to conceal our midnight doings. The place was far from any road and in sight of no other house, yet precautions were nonetheless necessary, since rumours of strange lights started by chance nocturnal roamers would soon bring disaster on our enterprise. It was agreed to call the whole thing a chemical laboratory if discovery should occur. Gradually, we equipped our sinister haunt of science with materials either purchased in Boston or quietly borrowed from the college. Materials carefully made unrecognizable, safe to expert eyes, and provided spades and picks for the many burials we should have to make in the cellar. At the college, we used an incinerator, but the apparatus was too costly for our unauthorized laboratory. Bodies were always a nuisance, even the small guinea pig bodies from the slight clandestine experiments in West's room at the boarding house. We followed the local death notices like ghouls, for our specimens demanded particular qualities. What we wanted were corpses interred soon after death and without artificial preservation, preferably free from malforming disease and certainly with all organs present. Accident victims were our best hope. Not for many weeks did we hear of anything suitable, though we talked with morgue and hospital authorities, ostensibly in the college's interest, as often as we could without exciting suspicion. We found that the college had first choice in every case, so that it might be necessary to remain in Arkham during the summer when only the limited summer school classes were held. In the end, though, luck favoured us. For one day we heard of an almost ideal case in the Potter's Field. A brawny young workman drowned only the morning before in Summers Pond, and buried at the town's expense without delay or embalming. That afternoon, we found a new grave, and determined to begin work soon after midnight. It was a repulsive task that we undertook in the black small hours, even though we lacked at the time the special horror of graveyards which later experiences brought to us. We carried spades and oil dark lanterns, for although electric torches were then manufactured, they were not as satisfactory as the tungsten contrivances of today. The process of unearthing was slow and sordid. It might have been gruesomely poetical if we had been artists instead of scientists, and we were glad when our spades struck wood. When the pine box was fully uncovered, West scrambled down and removed the lid, dragging out and propping up the contents. I reached down and hauled the contents out of the grave, and then both toiled hard to restore the spot to its former appearance. The affair made us rather nervous, especially the stiff form and vacant face of our first trophy, but we managed to remove all traces of our visit. When we had patted down the last shovelful of earth, we put the specimen in a canvas sack and set out to our old Chapman place beyond Meadow Hill. On an improvised dissecting table in the old farmhouse, by the light of a powerful acetylene lamp, the specimen was not very spectral looking. It had been a sturdy and apparently unimaginative youth of wholesome plebeian type. Large-framed, grey-eyed and brown-haired, a sound animal without psychological subtleties, and probably having vital processes of the simplest and healthiest sort. Now, with the eyes closed, it looked more asleep than dead, though the expert test of my friend soon left no doubt to that score. We had at last what West had always longed for, a real dead man of the ideal kind, ready for the solution as prepared according to the most careful calculations and theories for human use. The tension on our part became very great. We knew that there was scarcely a chance for anything like complete success, and could not avoid hideous fears at possible grotesque results of partial animation. Especially were we apprehensive concerning the mind and impulses of the creature, since in the space following death some of the more delicate cerebral cells might well have suffered deterioration. I myself still held some curious notions about the traditional soul of man, and felt in awe at the secrets that might be told by one returning from the dead. I wondered what sights this placid youth might have seen in inaccessible spheres, and what we could relate if fully restored to life. But my wonder was not overwhelming, since for the most part I shared the materialism of my friend. He was calmer than I, as he forced a large quantity of his fluid into the vein of this body's arm, immediately binding the incision securely. The waiting was gruesome, but West never faltered. Every now and then he applied his stethoscope to the specimen and bore the negative results philosophically. After about 3/4 of an hour, without the least sign of life, we disappointedly pronounced the solution inadequate, but determined to make the most of his opportunity and try one change in the formula before disposing of his ghastly prize. We had that afternoon dug a grave in the cellar and would have to fill it by dawn, for although we had fixed a lock on the house, we wished to shun even the remotest risk of a ghoulish discovery. Besides, the body would not be even approximately fresh the next night. So taking the solitary lamp into the adjacent laboratory, we left our silent guest on the slab in the dark and bent every energy to the mixing of a new solution. The weighing and measuring supervised by West with an almost fanatical care. The awful event was very sudden and wholly unexpected. I was pouring something from one test tube to another, and West was busy over the alcohol blast lamp, which had to answer for a Bunsen burner in this gasless edifice. When from the pitch black room we had left, there burst the most appalling and demonic succession of cries that either of us had ever heard. Not more unutterable could have been the chaos of hellish sound if the pit itself had opened to release the agony of the damned. For in one inconceivable cacophony was centered all the supernal terror and unnatural despair of animate nature. Human it could not have been. It is not in man to make such sounds, and without a thought of our late employment or its possible discovery, both West and I leaped from the nearest window like stricken animals, overturning tubes, lamps and retorts, and vaulting madly into the starred abyss of the auroral night. I think we screamed ourselves as we stumbled frantically towards the town, though as we reached the outskirts we put on a semblance of restraint, just enough to seem like belated revellers staggering home from a night of debauchery. We did not separate, but managed to get to West's room, where we whispered with the gas up until dawn. By then, we had calmed ourselves a little with rational theories and plans for investigation, so that we could sleep through the day, classes being disregarded. But that evening, 2 items in the paper, wholly unrelated, made it again impossible for us to sleep. The old deserted Chapman house had inexplicably burned to an amorphous heap of ashes. That we could understand because of the upset lamp. Also, an attempt had been made to disturb a new grave in the potter's field, as if by futile and spadeless clawing at the earth. That we could not understand, for we had patted down the mould very carefully. And for 17 years after that, West would look frantically over his shoulder and complain of fancied footsteps behind him. Now he has disappeared. So what do you think of that first one?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's first-hand account, but like, as in, like, he's trustable, yeah.
Oh, Daniel, I have no idea. No one really knows anything about Daniel Kane, so that's up in the air too.
Okay.
But we'll move on to the next part and we'll see. Yeah, you can make up your mind. We have 6 parts to get through over the next 2 episodes, I reckon. I don't know if we'll fit this into one, but we'll see. Anyway, yeah, we'll move on to 2 and you can make your decision up by the time we get to the end.
Okay, it's honesty time. We have a confession to make. We suck at socials, no good at Insta, can't send a tweet or an X or whatever that super villain looking motherfucker is calling it now. Stick to your space cars, Elon. But we know you want to chat, you want to be kept updated, you want to be alive all the goddamn time, so we're getting down from the antisocial soapbox and giving this a try. So come chat to us on Insta and Twitter at AliveAlivePod, or hit us up by email at itsalivealivepod@gmail.com. We want to hear from you. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. This is a project, it's still a work in progress, and we just want to give you more what you like and less of what you can't stand. So give us a like, give us a follow, we'll always hit you back and we'll always try to reply to everyone. So come say hi. We don't bite. Well, at least Aimee doesn't. And she keeps me well fed, so you got nothing to worry about. Now, back to the show.
Okay, so you ready for part 2?
Yes.
Okay, so this one is called Part 2, The Plague Demon.
Ooh.
It is Demon, right? That's
Demon.
Why did it have the A there?
It's
in
the old
front of the E?
spelling of demon.
Okay, so Demon then. Mm-hmm. Okay. I shall never forget that hideous summer 16 years ago, when like a noxious affright from the halls of the Eblis typhoid stalked leeringly through Arkham. It was by that satanic scourge that most recall the year, for truly terror brooded with bat wings over the piles of coffins in the tombs of Christchurch Cemetery. Yet for me, there is a greater horror in that time, a horror known to me alone now that Herbert West has disappeared. West and I were doing postgraduate work in summer classes at the medical school of Miskatonic University, and my friend had attained a wide notoriety because of his experiments leading towards the revivification of the dead. After the scientific slaughter of uncounted small animals, the freakish work had ostensibly stopped by order of our skeptical dean, Dr. Alan Halsey, though West had continued to perform certain secret tests in his dingy boarding house room, and had at one terrible and unforgettable occasion taken a human body from its grave in the potter's field to a deserted farmhouse beyond Meadow Hill. I was with him on that odious occasion and saw him inject into the still veins the elixir which he thought would to some extent restore life's chemical and physical processes. It had ended horribly, in a delirium of fear which we gradually came to attribute to our own overwrought nerves, and West had never afterwards been able to shake off a maddening sensation of being haunted and hunted. The body had not been quite fresh enough. It is obvious that to restore normal mental attributes, a body must be very fresh indeed, and a burning of the old house had prevented us from burying the thing. It would have been better if we could have known it was underground. After that experience, West had dropped his researches for some time, but as the zeal of the born scientist slowly returned, he again became importunate with the college faculty, pleading for the use of the dissecting room and of fresh human specimens for the work he regarded as so overwhelmingly important. His pleas, however, were wholly in vain, for the decision of Dr. Halsey was inflexible, and other professors all endorsed the verdict of their leader. In the radical theory of reanimation, they saw nothing but the immature vagaries of a youthful enthusiast whose slight form, yellow hair, spectacled blue eyes, and soft voice gave no hint of the supernormal, almost diabolical power of the cold brain within. I can see him now as he was then, and I shiver. He grew sterner of face, but never elderly. And now Sefton Asylum has had the mishap, and West has vanished. West clashed disagreeably with Dr. Halsey near the end of our last undergraduate term in a wordy dispute that did less credit to him than to the kindly dean in point of courtesy. He felt that he was needlessly and irrationally retarded in a supremely great work, a work which he could of course conduct to suit himself in later years, but which he wished to begin while still possessed of the exceptional facilities of the university. That the traditional bound elders should ignore his singular results on animals and persist in their denial of the possibility of reanimation was inexpressibly disgusting and almost incomprehensible to a youth of West's logical temperament. Only greater maturity could help him understand the chronic mental limitations of the Professor Doctor type, the product of generations of pathetic puritanism, kindly, conscientious, and sometimes gentle and amiable, yet always narrow, intolerant, custom-ridden, and lacking of perspective. Age was more charity for these incomplete yet high-souled characters, whose worst real vice is timidity, and who are ultimately punished by general ridicule for their intellectual sins. Sins like Ptolemaism, Calvinism, anti-Darwinism, anti-Nietzscheism, and every sort of Sabbatarianism and sumptuary legislation. West, young despite his marvellous scientific acquirements, had scant patience with good Dr. Halsey and his erudite colleagues, and nursed an increasing resentment, coupled with a desire to prove his theories to these obtuse worthies in some striking and dramatic fashion. Like most youths, he indulged in elaborate daydreams of revenge, triumph, and finally magnanimous forgiveness. And then had come the scourge, grinning and lethal from the nightmare caverns of Tartarus. West and I had graduated about the time of its beginning, but had remained for additional work at the summer school, so that we were in Arkham when it broke with full demonic fury upon the town. Though not yet licensed physicians, we now had our degrees and were pressed frantically into public service as the numbers of the stricken grew. The situation was almost past management, and deaths ensued too frequently for the local undertakers fully to handle. Burials without embalming were made in rapid succession, and even the Christchurch Cemetery receiving tomb was crammed with coffins of the unembalmed dead. This circumstance was not without effect on West, who thought often of the irony of the situation. So many fresh specimens, yet none for his persecuted research. We were frightfully overworked, and the terrific mental and nervous strain made my friend brood morbidly. But West's gentle enemies were no less harassed with prostrating duties. College had all but closed, and every doctor of the medical faculty was helping to fight the typhoid plague. Dr. Halsey in particular had distinguished himself in sacrificing service, applying his extreme skill with wholehearted energy to cases which many others shunned because of danger or apparent hopelessness. Before a month was over, the fearless dean had become a popular hero, though he seemed unconscious of his fame as he struggled to keep from collapsing with physical fatigue and nervous exhaustion. West could not withhold admiration for the fortitude of his foe, but because of this was even more determined to prove to him the truth of his amazing doctrines. Taking advantage of the disorganization of both college work and municipal health regulations, he managed to get a recently deceased body smuggled into the university dissecting room one night, and in my presence injected a new modification of his solution. The thing actually opened its eyes, but only stared at the ceiling with a look of soul-petrifying horror before collapsing into an inertness from which nothing could rouse it. West said it was not fresh enough. The hot summer air does not favour corpses. That time we were almost caught before we incinerated the thing, and West doubted the advisability of repeating his daring misuse of the college laboratory. The peak of the epidemic was reached in August. West and I were almost dead, and Dr. Halsey did die on the 14th. The students all attended the hasty funeral on the 15th and bought an impressive wreath, though the latter was quite overshadowed by the tribute sent by wealthy Arkham citizens and by the municipality itself. It was almost a public affair, for the dean had surely been a public benefactor. After the entombment, we were all somewhat depressed and spent the afternoon at the bar of the commercial house, where West, though shaken by the death of his chief opponent, chilled the rest of us with references to his notorious theories. Most of the students went home, or to various duties as the evening advanced, but West persuaded me to aid him in making a night of it. West's landlady saw us arrive at his room about 2 a.m, with a third man between us, and told her husband that we had all evidently dined and wined rather well. Apparently the Cecilius matron was right, for about 3 a.m. the whole house was aroused by cries coming from West's room, where when they broke down the door they found the two of us unconscious on the blood-stained carpet, beaten, scratched and mauled, and with the broken remnants of West's bottles and instruments around us. Only an open window told what became of our assailant, and many wondered how he himself had fared after the terrific leap from the second story to the lawn which he must have made. There were some strange garments in the room, but West, upon regaining consciousness, said that they did not belong to the stranger, but were specimens collected for bacteriological analysis in the course of investigations on the transmission of germ diseases. He ordered them burnt as soon as possible in the capacious fireplace. To the police we both declared ignorance of our late companion's identity. He was, West nervously said, a congenial stranger whom we had met at some downtown bar of uncertain location. We had all been rather jovial, and West and I did not wish to have our pugnacious companion hunted down. That same night saw the beginning of the second Arkham horror, the horror that to me eclipsed the plague itself. Christchurch Cemetery was the scene of a terrible killing, a watchman having been clawed to death in a manner not only too hideous for description but raising a doubt as to the human agency of the deed. The victim had been seen alive considerably after midnight. The dawn revealed the unutterable thing. The manager of a circus at the neighbouring town of Bolton was questioned, but he swore that no beast had at any time escaped from his cage. Those who found the body noted a trail of blood leading to the receiving tomb, where a small pool of red lay on the concrete just outside the gate. A fainter trail led away towards the woods, but it soon gave out. The next night devils danced on the roofs of Arkham and unnatural madness howled in the wind. Through the fevered town had crept the curse which some said was greater than the plague, and which some whispered was the embodied demon soul of the plague itself. 8 houses were entered by a nameless thing which strewed red death in its wake. In all, 17 maimed and shapeless remnants of bodies were left behind by the voiceless, sadistic monster that crept abroad. A few persons had half seen it in the dark and had said it was white and like a malformed ape or anthropomorphic fiend. It had not left behind quite all that it had attacked, for sometimes it had been hungry. The number it had killed was 14. 3 of the bodies had been in stricken homes and had not been alive. On the third night, frantic bands of searchers led by the police captured it in a house on Crane Street near the Miskatonic campus. They had organised the quest with care, keeping in touch by means of volunteer telephone stations, and when someone in the college district had reported hearing it scratching at a shutter window, the net was quickly spread. On account of the general alarm and precautions, there were only 2 more victims, and the capture was effected without major casualties. The thing was finally stopped by a bullet, though not a fatal one, and was rushed to the local hospital amidst universal excitement and loathing. For it had been a man. This much was clear despite the nauseous eyes, the voiceless simianism, and the demonic savagery. They dressed its wounds and catered to it in the asylum at Sefton, where it beat its head against the wall of the padded cells for 16 years, until the recent mishap, when it escaped under circumstances that few like to mention. What had most disgusted the searchers of Arkham was the thing they noticed when the monster's face was cleaned. The mocking, unbelievable resemblance to a learned and self-sacrificing martyr who had been entombed but 3 days before, the late Dr. Alan Halsey, public benefactor and dean of the medical school at the Miskatonic University. To the vanished Herbert West and to me the disgust and horror were supreme. I shudder tonight as I think of it, shudder even more than I did that morning when West muttered through his bandages, "Damn it, it wasn't quite fresh enough." So 3 days is too long.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the clock now and I think it's time to concede this Reanimator series is going to go to round 3. We're getting to the end of today's show and we're barely cracked the surface of Herbert West's story. But before we go, I'll give you one more story from the Confessions of Daniel Kane.
God, I don't know how much they're swaying for me in favour of corpse reanimation, but they're great, scary stories.
Yeah, they are pretty good, all right. See, I called him Daniel Crane. I'm fucking watching way too much Frasier at the moment.
You are.
So this one is called, and this is the last one for today, it is called Part 3, 6 Shots by Midnight. It is uncommon to fire all 6 shots of a revolver with great suddenness, when one would probably be sufficient. But many things in the life of Herbert West were uncommon. It is, for instance, not often that a young physician leaving college is obliged to conceal the principles which guide his selection of a home and office, yet that was the case with Herbert West. When he and I obtained our degrees at the medical school of Miskatonic University and sought to relieve our poverty by setting up as general practitioners, we took great care not to say that we chose our house because it was fairly well isolated and as near as possible to the potter's field. Reticence such as this is seldom without a cause, nor indeed was ours, for our requirements were those resulting from a life work distinctly unpopular. Outwardly, we were doctors only, but beneath the surface were aims of far greater and more terrible moment. For the essence of Herbert West's existence was a quest amid black and forbidden realms of the unknown, in which he hoped to uncover the secret of life and restore to perpetual animation the graveyard's cold clay. Such a quest demands strange materials, among them fresh human bodies, and in order to keep supplied with these indispensable things, one must live quietly and not far from a place of informal interment. West and I had met in college, and I had been the only one to sympathize with his hideous experiments. Gradually, I had come to be his inseparable assistant, and now that we were out of college, we had to keep it together. It was not easy to find a good opening for 2 doctors in company, but finally the influence of the university secured us a practice in Bolton, a factory town near Arkham, the seat of the college. The Bolton worsted mills are the largest in the Miskatonic Valley, and their polyglot employees were never popular as patients with the local physicians. We chose our house with the greatest care, seizing at last on a rather run-down cottage near the end of Pond Street, 5 numbers from the closest neighbour, and separated from the locals' potter field only by a stretch of meadowland, bisected by a narrow neck of the rather dense forest which lies to the north. The distance was greater than we wished, but we could get no nearer house without going on the other side of the field, wholly out of the factory district. We were not much displeased, however, since there were no people between us and our sinister source of supplies. The walk was a trifle long, but we could haul our silent specimens undisturbed. Our practice was surprisingly large from the very first, large enough to please most young doctors, and large enough to prove a bore and a burden to students whose real interests lay elsewhere. The mill hands were of somewhat turbulent inclinations, and besides their many natural needs, their frequent clashes and stabbing affrays gave us plenty to do. But what actually absorbed our minds was the secret laboratory we had fitted up in the cellar. The laboratory with the long table under the electric lights, where in the small hours of the morning we often injected West's various solutions into the veins of the things we dragged from the potter's field. West was experimenting madly to find something which would start man's vital motions anew after they had been stopped by the thing we called death, but had encountered the most ghastly obstacles. The solution had to be differently compounded for different types. What would serve for guinea pigs would not serve for human beings, and different human specimens required large modifications. The bodies had to be exceedingly fresh, or the slight decomposition of brain tissue would render a perfect reanimation impossible. Indeed, the greatest problem was to get them fresh enough. West had had horrible experiences during his secret college research with corpses of doubtful vintage. The results of partial or imperfect animation were much more hideous than were the total failures, and we both held fearsome recollections of such thing. Ever since our first demonic session in the deserted farmhouse on Meadow Hill in Arkham, we had felt a brooding menace. And West, though a calm, blonde, blue-eyed scientific automaton in most respects, often confessed to a shuddering sensation of stealthy pursuit. He half felt that he was followed, a psychological delusion of shaken nerves enhanced by the undeniable disturbing fact that at least one of our reanimated specimens was still alive, a frightful carnivorous thing in a padded cell in Sefton. Then there was another, our first, whose exact fate we had never learned. We had fair luck with specimens in Bolton, much better than in Arkham. We had not been settled a week before we got an accident victim, on a very night of burial, and made it open its eyes with an amazingly rational expression before the solution failed. It had lost an arm. If it had been a perfect body, we might have succeeded better. Between then and next January, we secured 3 more. 1 total failure, 1 case of marked muscular motion, and 1 rather shivery thing. It rose to itself and uttered a sound. Then came a period when luck was poor. Interments fell off, and those that did occur were as of specimens either too diseased or too maimed for use. We kept track of all the deaths and their circumstances with systematic care. One March night, however, we unexpectedly obtained a specimen which did not come from the potter's field. In Bolton, the prevailing spirit of Puritanism had outlawed the sport of boxing, with the usual result. Surreptitious and ill-conducted bouts among the mill workers were common, and occasionally professional talent of low grade was imported. This late winter night there had been such a match, evidently with disastrous results. Since 2 timorous Poles had come to us with incoherently whispered entreaties to attend to a very secret and desperate case, we followed them to an abandoned barn where the remnants of a crowd of frightened foreigners were watching a silent still form on the floor. The match had been between Kid O'Brien, a lubberly and now quaking youth with a most un-Hibernian hooked nose, and Buck Robinson, the Harlem Smoke. Robinson had been knocked out, and a moment's examination showed us that he had permanently remained so. Fear was upon the whole pitiful crowd, for they did not know what the law would exact upon them if the affair were not hushed up, and they were grateful when West, in spite of my involuntary shudders, offered to get rid of the thing quietly, for a purpose I knew too well. There was bright moonlight over the snowless landscape, but we dressed the thing and carried it home between us through the deserted streets and meadows, as we had carried a similar thing one horrible night in Arkham. We approached the house from the field in the rear, took the specimen in the back door and down the cellar stairs, and prepared it for the usual experiments. Our fear of the police was absurdly great, though we had timed our trip to avoid the solitary patrolman of that section. The result was wearily anticlimactic. Ghastly as our prize appeared, it was wholly unresponsive to every solution we injected into its huge arms, solutions prepared from experience with smaller specimens only. So as the hour grew dangerously near to dawn, we did as we had done with others. Dragged the thing across the meadows to the neck of the woods near the potter's field and buried it there in the best sort of grave the frozen ground would furnish. The grave was not very deep, but fully as good as that of the previous specimen, the thing which had risen of itself and uttered a sound. In the light of our dark lanterns, we carefully covered it with leaves and dead vines, fairly certain that the police would never find it in the forest so dim and dense. The next day, I was increasingly apprehensive about the police, for a patient brought rumours of a suspected fight and death. West had still another source of worry, for he had been called in the afternoon to a case which ended very threateningly. An Italian woman had become hysterical over her missing child, a lad of 5 who had strayed off early in the morning and failed to appear for dinner, and had developed symptoms highly alarming in view of an almost weak heart. It was a very foolish hysteria, for the boy had often run away before, but Italian peasants were exceedingly superstitious, and this woman seemed as much harassed by omens as by the facts. About 7 o'clock in the evening she had died, and her frantic husband had made a frightful scene in his effort to kill West, whom he widely blamed for not saving her life. Friends had held him when he drew a stiletto, but West departed amidst his inhumane shrieks, curses and oaths of vengeance. In his latest affliction, the fellow seemed to have forgotten his child, whom was still missing as the night advanced. There was some talk of searching the woods, but most of the family's friends were busy with the dead woman and the screaming man. Altogether, the nervous strain upon West must have been tremendous. Thoughts of the police and of the mad Italian both weighed heavily. We retired at about 11, but I did not sleep well. Bolton had a surprisingly good police force for such a small town, and I could not help fearing the mess which would ensue if the affair of the night before were ever tracked down. It might mean the end of our local work, and perhaps prison for both West and me. I did not like those rumours of a fight which were floating about. After the clock had struck 3, the moon shone in my eyes, but I turned over without rising to pull down the shade. Then came the steady rattling at the back door. I lay still and somewhat dazed, but before long heard West's rap on the door. He was clad in a dressing gown and slippers, and had in his hands a revolver and an electric flashlight. From the revolver I knew he was thinking more of the crazed Italian than the police. "We'd better both go," he whispered. "It wouldn't do not to answer it anyway, and it may be a patient. It would be like one of those fools to try the back door." So we both went down the stairs on tiptoe, with a fear partially justified and partially that which comes only from the soul of the weird small hours. The rattling continued, growing somewhat louder. When we reached the door, I cautiously unbolted it and threw it open, and as the moon streamed revealing down on the form silhouetted there, West did a peculiar thing. Despite the obvious danger of attracting notice and bringing down on our heads the dreaded police investigation, a thing which after all was mercifully averted by the relative isolation of our cottage, my friend suddenly, excitedly and unnecessarily emptied all 6 chambers of his revolver into the nocturnal visitor. For that visitor was neither Italian nor policeman. Looming hideously against the spectral moon was a gigantic, misshapen thing not to be imagined save in nightmares. A glassy-eyed, shadow-like apparition nearly on all 4s, covered with bits of mould, leaves and vines, foul with cake blood, and having between its glistening teeth a snow-white, terrible, cylindrical object terminating in a tiny hand.
And what was in the hand?
I don't know. That's it. That's all that's in it. So, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out in our next episode when we go to part 3 of Trioxin Gas and Re-Animation. Next episode, the story really ramps up and we get the doctors enlisting in the Canadian Army for World War II in search of fresh specimens. And we go back to Dr. Phillips as he fills us in on the research and demise of Dr. Herbert West.
Can't wait. Until then, check out all our classic episodes. I personally love our paranormal shows like the episode on Pazuzu and the series on the Demon Toby.
Yeah. And if you're done with all that, then you can check out our Patreon page at It's Alive Alive Pod, where for only $5 a month, you get great shows like Real Monsters and Playing with Bones, along with classic shows like Behind the Mask.
Don't forget to follow us on all social platforms at Alive Alive Pod and check out my own Instagram page at Aimee Rose IAA.
We'll be back next week with more tales from the Horrorverse. It's Alive Alive Podcast, all the guts and gore with none of the guilt. See you all next time. Same Alive Alive time, same Horrorverse channel. Okay, love you. Bye-bye.
Okay, lady. Love you. Bye-bye.